Hey guys, Scott here with phasingplayer.com. You looked at the title of this video, you know what this is about. This is me giving my thoughts on the Leader Games game Oath. This is actually the, I think, fourth time now that I've sat down, or stood up, I guess, to record this video. It's taken me a really long time. I think I made my first attempt at recording this like 6 months ago, maybe. And we're actually coming up on a year since Oath started to arrive on people's doorsteps. And I found out every time I would play the game, I played it a handful of times and decided, okay, I think I have a good feeling for what Oath is, or for what I feel, how I feel about Oath. And so I'm gonna record, write some of my thoughts down, record this video. My buddies and I enjoyed the game. Spoiler alert, I like the game. We would sit down to play it again, and I'd find after playing it that my thoughts changed. And so I would kind of go back to what I'd written down and change it up a little bit. And then we'd end up playing the game again because we were enjoying it. We were playing it a couple of times a month, maybe more than a couple of times a month. And I would find my thoughts are different again after playing it again. So I kept playing the game and changing my thoughts. And I think every time I played, my thoughts would be a bit different. My feelings on the game would be a bit different, which makes it really hard to nail down a review. It's been a couple of months now since we've played our last game. I think we've played it like maybe 8 or 10 times, I want to say. Largely the same group with some changes. I've endeavored to get my thoughts down, and so I decided, let's just do it right now. It's like going on 1:30 in the morning, I think, right now. Now, before I get into my thoughts, I do want to say Leader Games did provide me a copy of this game, so I did not pay for it. Anything that I say about the game, including what I said before when I liked it, just understand it comes from that context that I was provided a complimentary copy of the game. So a big reason, I think, why my thoughts on Oath keep changing every time I play it is because it is hard to figure out, for me anyway, it's been hard to figure out what about Oath is really hitting me in such a satisfying way. Like I said before, I like Oath. I like Oath a lot, actually. I've played all of Cole Worley's games, both PAX Premieres and Infamous Traffic, John Company, First Edition. I haven't played Second Edition yet, Root. And I might say that Oath is my favorite of all of them, and I like PAX Premiere. I love John Company. I do like Root, but I don't love Root. But I do love Oath. Oath is great. And I've been trying to figure out what it was I like about it. And it's really, I think, come down to one thing that Oath does really well. And honestly, big picture, it's something that Cole Worley does really well in his games. It's something that I appreciate about all of his games, is that they have strong themes and strong messages that they're getting across. Whether or not they're all super intentional, I think they are, considering his developer diaries that he writes. He puts a lot of thought into this sort of thing, but all his games give really strong, they have really strong forward-facing themes. And what I'm picking up most strongly in Oath, and something that I really like that kind of sticks with me, is the way Oath handles its own history and how it comments on the role of empire and the role of individuals in establishing and writing a history. Something that I find every time I go to Oath is that it sort of ultimately discards the contribution of individuals to a world's history, and instead says that only the winner writes history, and not only the winner, but the winning faction, the winning empire, is the one that writes history about itself and about the world that it exists in. The contribution of individuals ultimately sort of fades away in Oath. While the game is played with several players and they're all controlling ostensibly an individual, and a group of followers that individual has, but you have one big chunky meeple that represents like your main dude. At the end of the game, all individual accomplishments are thrown to the side, and the only thing that survives is going to be the winning player's empire. Places that empire controlled, artifacts that that empire held onto. Relics, I should say, is what they're called. But the individual accomplishments that that player or the other players even get is erased. Any sort of associations or friendships or alliances that they've made with natives to this world are cast aside, which is to say the tableau, the personal tableaus that the players build up, gone. Any sort of favor, any sort of secrets that they've accumulated, also gone. The only thing that maintains from game to game in Oath is going to be the locations that the winning player, who becomes ostensibly the new ruling class in the next game, the only thing that survives is the locations they had presence, the locations they controlled. At the end of a game, the winning player can grant citizenship in their empire to the other players, and that maintains. But again, that's still really just representing the reach of the winning and existing empire. Everything else, thrown aside. You remember the big changes that the empire makes from game to game, from generation to generation. How maybe over the course of 3 generations, one empire, a single empire, continued to rule, continued to expand their power, continued to harness relics and artifacts, and continued to either exile or grant new citizenship within their rule. And then, maybe on the following generation, that empire crumbles. But what comes up in their place? It is always a new empire, which is another thing that Oath really builds on as far as thematics go. In the wake of one empire crumbling, in the wake of any individual effort, something new will rise from the ashes of the old and defeated. And something I like about all of this is that it can tell really interesting emergent stories that I think will be different from player to player. Probably you'll run into some similarity ultimately, at least early on in your chronicle, which is what the game calls its sort of persistent ongoing campaign. Because a lot of the cards the players are going to start with are going to be the same cards. In fact, I don't know why I said a lot, all of them. All of the cards at the beginning of the game are going to be the same cards. As you play, you'll add new cards into your world that you're building up, and you'll take old cards out. So over time, players will start to have different experiences as the options, the potential cards that show up in their world, the potential denizens and features of the land show up and go away. Then you'll start to see divergence, but that's going to take several games before you really get to any sort of critical mass of difference in your games. At the end of every game, the winner gets to remove at random, sort of at random, some cards from the previous deck and then insert new cards into that deck for the next game. Honestly, that's one of the more significant things that changes from game to game. There's not a whole lot else that changes, honestly, from game to game of Oath, which I don't want to say it's disappointing, but you definitely start to notice some of the same locations showing up again and again, or if the winning player controlled like everything at game end, which has happened to me, then you won't really add anything new into the game, at least not in terms of like locations. Normally, like I said before, the only locations that survive are what the previous empire or the winning empire held onto in their power. Everything else gets discarded, sort of like a consolidation of power. If the empire doesn't hold it, it is discarded and forgotten in history. But if the empire controls everything, everything is remembered. And you can end up with games where an empire might hold everything or nearly everything for consecutive games if enough other players can't rally together to knock down their power. And it can be hard. Honestly, it can be really tough to uproot a very strong defender in a location. And that can lead to several consecutive games sort of being the same, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can feel a little stagnant, but also if you have the same group of players playing game after game after game, you can sort of get this like rallying cry as you go forward where the non-citizens will start working together more to uproot the existing empire and overthrow them. Sort of does scorched earth burn the land down in order to build anew, which again, as I said before, is sort of a strong theme in Oath, that eventually every empire is going to crumble. But that doesn't mean empire is done, conceptually. It means a new empire is going to rise from the ashes of the old one. Something I would have maybe liked to see in this game, and I try not to be like an armchair game designer, so don't see me saying this as like some big weakness in Oath, but something that I think would be interesting that could end up being too fiddly, and I understand why it's not there, is maybe a way to differentiate empire to empire to empire, because they can end up feeling sort of the same. You want to get a hold of the same sort of cards, you want to get a hold of the same sort of stuff, especially if there's like one or two strong defending locations that are really hard to topple. Every winning player is going to try to topple those, and if they do, they'll probably succeed and then win the game by holding on to these places. That's been my experience anyway. You get a couple of good cards in one spot, and whoever can hold that will probably maintain control of the game. And again, that sort of repetition can be interesting, sort of like a King of the Hill style of gameplay that sort of just emerges naturally if the right things come up. Which I love emergent storytelling in games. I love emergent gameplay in games. Things that aren't expressly planned out and written down, that just sort of come together through player agency and random chance. When those two things mix together in the right way, it's wonderful. And it works really well in Oath. It comes up at the right times, hits these beautiful crescendos and stories. And it's my favorite thing about Oath, is the way it tells stories and the way that players can really invest themselves in it. I've read some criticism that people feel as though Oath can come down to a random die roll that'll suddenly end the game. And that is kind of true. You can certainly run into a point halfway through a given game. Oath's played out over a fixed number of rounds, potentially, a maximum number of rounds, I should say. And halfway through, you'll start to roll dice to see if the game ends. And the thing is, you can control the odds of the game ending with a die roll for every round leading up to the first time you're going to roll that die. It's only going to get rolled under certain circumstances. And if the other players are going to kind of dominate the board in such a way where they can control those circumstances to where the die roll doesn't happen, I mean, baby, that's player agency right there. Yes, there is a die roll, but whether or not the dice get rolled is based on what the players are going to do. So I think that's a really good system. I think it's also something that adds a ton of tension to a given game. Once that first die roll comes up, if you're the chancellor, the head of the empire, and you're holding on for dear life, you want to maintain that status quo, and you manage to get to a point where you will be able to roll that d6 and hope that the game ends. It's a really tense roll. And I have seen chancellors who are just getting slaughtered manage to enable that die roll, and on a 1 in 6 chance nail that 6, and you wipe the sweat from their brow, like, whew, I didn't think I was going to make it out of there. And they do, and it's really exciting. It's really exciting for the players that are going to continue playing. One thing that I found about Oath, and the way it tells its stories over multiple games, is that if you are not a player playing every single game, and you're slotting in the middle of like a Chronicle with other players being more consistent, that slotting in player or players probably won't really appreciate the long-term storytelling that's being told. The rulebook does suggest that you can kind of skip games in a Chronicle, that if you're not present for every single game, that's okay. And mechanically, that's true. Oath will mechanically support players being slotted in and out because no one faction is changing really from game to game. I mean, the Chancellor, the ruler of the Empire does change a little bit, but generally anyone can play any faction and there's no ownership of faction involved. They all start essentially from 0 every single game. There's no persistence with non-Chancellor factions. But again, the strongest thing Oath does, mechanically it's a fun game. Strategically, it's not bad. It's got some good tactics. But the strongest thing it does is its emergent long-term storytelling. Some games can be, boring in a vacuum, but those kind of uneventful games can really slot into a story that's being told over 7 or 8 or 9 or 15 games. And over the course of that, they can be kind of sections that you can look back on and say, oh, the world was kind of quiet. There wasn't a lot of warfare this time. But if you look at what happened next, you can see it laying the seeds to something, big and incredible. But if you're just jumping in for one night and you're in one of these boring games, you're going to walk away thinking, oh, this isn't very good. Or if you're entering into one of these games that is sort of stagnant in terms of movement, maybe 3 of the 5 players feel tension, but the 2 new players are like, I don't understand why anything, isn't moving. I don't understand how I can change this system. So even though Oath does allow players to come in and out, you should really have one group that you're playing this with, I think, because you'll notice much more of a story arc, of a narrative that's being built, if you can see the whole story. Something also about Oath that my group, for whatever reason, consistently struggles with is the combat. The combat in Oath is pretty quick, it is very decisive, it is not complex at all, but for whatever reason, my group, myself included, cannot remember which dice to roll depending on which side of the combat you're on. We always have to double check how many dice an attacker rolls, how many dice a defender rolls, what static number do you add to your side. I don't know why it's so complicated for us. Maybe we're just dumb, but there's fortunately a handy flowchart in Oath that we check all the time. Honestly, like 3 and 4 times a game. We can play Oath twice in like 1 week, or 3 times in a month or something, and still every single time we'll double check this flowchart. Maybe it's just us. I don't know why it's difficult, but it is. Oath's combat is also really punishing. When you get involved in a fight, boy, you better be ready to fight. You better be ready to maybe lose like all of your forces that you've spent multiple turns building up. It's not as harsh as something like Dune, as far as combat goes, but it can really be devastating if you have a hard fail. And sometimes you feel like the odds are really on your side, and then just the dice don't get the results that you need. And that's all right. Again, and I'm gonna say this 100 more times, I'm sure. Oath is a storytelling game. There's gonna be failure in the story. Not everyone is a hero. Not everyone has these great, odds-defying David and Goliath moments. They come up once in a while, and that's great. That's beneficial to telling a story. If these David versus Goliath sort of situations came up every single time you played Oath in every single combat, they wouldn't be exciting. They wouldn't be exclamation points on a narrative arc in this game. So when they do come up, because they're kind of rare, you can have, again, as I mentioned, really staunch defenders that are just like, I am not going anywhere because I have these ramparts and I have these wrestlers and I have all this stuff. When they do eventually topple, it's really exciting and everyone remembers it and everyone hoots and hollers, and it's a really fun, exciting time. And it's a good moment in a grand story. If you don't like stories, though, in games, if you're looking for control and tactics and strategy and agency, Oath has a decent amount of that, but it also has some nonsense that you just have to go with. It also has a bunch of king making, where at the end of a game, it'll be your turn and you say, if I attack this player and win, then Haley wins. If I attack this player and lose, Brett wins. If I attack this player and win, James wins. I can't win. If I do nothing, then, someone else wins. You have the choice of who is going to win the game by your action. This comes up a lot in Oath. By design. And I love it. I don't think king making's a bad thing. The game is not everyone makes one choice and then someone wins. The whole game is a series of choices. Most games are a series of choices. And you can often trace back through the whole game why your choices led you down to this one path you're on right now. That's fine. If you're playing this game with a group and you're going to have a next game, you sort of build some alliances in there. And the choices you make then can socially maybe engineer some things in the next game. Not mechanically, though. Again, storytelling, not strong, strategic, tactical choices. They are there. There are tactical choices to make. This isn't like Tales of the Arabian Nights where it's just flip a page and read a piece of text. There is no flavor text in this game. But don't go looking for strong strategic and tactical play. It's storytelling, it's storytelling, it's storytelling. But it's good storytelling. And it's emergent storytelling. Again, no flavor text. It's all up here. It's all in your brain. The storytelling, though, has one thing that really kind of is sticking with me. And it's almost like a storm cloud hanging overhead, or maybe in the distance that I see coming on up. Oath doesn't have a fixed end to the game. Oath ends when you don't want to play it anymore. You can agree beforehand, hey, we're going to play 15 games of this and then we're done. But if you want, you could play 1,500 games of this before it would end. And even then, Oath would let you play more. It ends until you put the box away one last time and decide never to take it out. This isn't a legacy game. This isn't Pandemic Legacy or Gloomhaven, where there's going to be a finite amount of content in here. Ostensibly, every game of Oath is like sort of a random setup. If you played the previous games, you know that it's not perfectly random because there's stuff from the last game that's going to influence this one. But if you're a newcomer to a game of Oath, if you're playing in game 843 and you have not played any of the previous ones, it might as well just be a random setup to you. And because of that, and every game of Oath, because it is sort of leading into the next one thematically, in forever, every game of Oath ends in like an ellipsis. There's no final conclusion, the story is over. It's like if every single game of Oath was a movie, and every movie had an after-credits scene that set up the next movie. That's every game of Oath. Eventually you're going to watch the after-credits scene for the movie that you just played, and you're going to never see the next movie in that series because you put the box away for the last time, whether you know it or not. There is not going to be a satisfying conclusion to Oath, and that's the storm cloud that is kind of coming my way. While I'm enjoying the story that me and my buddies are making in Oath, I know there's never going to be a big period at the end of the game. And I think that's a little disappointing to me. It's like I almost don't want to see through to the end because I know there is no end. I worry that I'm not going to be satisfied with my last game of Oath. Because I enjoy the story getting told, I want there to be a satisfying conclusion, and Oath just is not going to give it to me. Which, I mean, going back to kind of thematics and messaging, the world is like that. At some point, every empire is going to crumble and fall, and a new empire of some sort is going to build up in its wake. And that'll go on as long as the planet Earth is around. When Rome fell, something else came up around it. When a great superpower of the world falls, something else comes up in its ashes, and that's, I think, Oath's way of saying that nothing ever really ends, nothing ever is final. There's always in the world view from 10,000 feet up, there's gonna be something else that comes later. It might not be appreciated by the people of the now, but Oath is a game that plays out over generations and generations. And eventually there will be a generation that has something new. And while I can appreciate that kind of thematic point Oath is making, as a player of the game, as a person in the here and now, it's, I think, just building me up to disappointment when there is no conclusion, there is no end, there is no satisfying credit roll that just stops. It's always going to be that after credit scene. And eventually I'm just not going to see the next movie. But that's it. I like Oath. Despite some of its I don't want to say shortcomings, but some things that are maybe less thrilling to me, I think it's a great game. I think it's a great achievement. Some people will love it. Some people won't like it at all. Probably Cole's most divisive game, I would guess, and probably in the big picture. So that's it. That's the video. I'm like, hopefully this is like the fourth time I've recorded this over the course of the last 6 or so months. Why now? Because I just feel like I gotta get it out. This is how I feel about Oath now. It might not be how I feel about Oath in a week or in a month or in a year, but it's how I feel right now. So that's it. That's the video.